Hey, what's up? John Sonmez from simpleprogrammer.com. So I got a question here about too many procedures. This is from Dennis. And Dennis says, in programming, limiting the size of functions to 30 lines or whatever you are taught in school by creating dozens of 2 to 3 line methods that are only used once just to keep the function line count down is stupid, in my opinion. Too hard to read and maintain, reminds me of too many notes. What other commonly accepted programming techniques are also rubbish? Well, Dennis, I hate to burst your bubble here, but you're assuming too much here, because I'm going to have to disagree with you on this one. I think that it's good to limit your procedures to 2 to 3 line procedures, because, and I'll tell you why this is. I did this sort of controversial blog post on why comments are bad, and that kind of explains it, and it goes through some examples of this. But essentially what you want to do, well, your primary job as a software developer is to manage complexity and to reduce complexity as much as possible. Because anyone can write a lot of code, right? That's not hard. What's hard is building a complex system, and what makes it hard is the complexity. That's what makes software development hard. It's managing complexity, is because any kind of trivial, I want you to write a simple algorithm, you can write an algorithm or a function, right? For the most part. Something trivial is easy to do, but to write a big complex system requires a lot of skill, and that skill is primarily in reducing complexity. And one of the primary ways that we reduce complexity is by making things simpler to understand and creating abstractions. And a function, at least as it can be used in software development, is an abstraction of sorts. Or a good function is an abstraction. A good function is a function where I can read the name of the function and I can know what it does and I can assume it does it and I don't have to look inside there. Okay? Now, can that happen with a 30-line function? Yes, but that level of abstraction is probably too low level detail because it's probably doing too much. If it's got 30 lines in there of code, you're probably going to have to go look into that function and figure out what those 30 lines are going to do, and you're going to have to hold those 30 lines in your head while you understand what is it actually trying to do, and it's not going to be self-explanatory because the name of that function is probably not going to adequately explain what it's doing. There's a lot of complexity, a lot of logic in there that you're probably going to have to dig into. But if instead of one 30-line function, you had one function, and then those 30 lines were broken up into, let's say, 5 functions of 6 lines each, and each one of them said, okay, essentially step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5. I'm doing this, I'm doing that, I'm doing that. Or maybe it was like step 1, step 2, and within step 1 and step 2, there were some more functions on step 1A, step 1B, step 1C, step 1C, step 2A, step 2B, step 2C, right? Those levels of abstraction are going to make it easier to understand because you only have to go as deep as you need to go depending on how far you dig. So you can still operate at that higher level, but when you get down there, you can understand things quicker, right? Because how much more quick is it for you to understand, assuming that it's correct, when a function's named something like read names from file? Okay, you understand that's what it is. It reads the names from the file, okay? How much easier is it for you to understand that than it is for you to understand 30 lines of code that read the names from the file? And maybe they have a comment that says, this section of code reads the names from the file, right? You can't take that for granted now. Now you got to go through that code and read that code. So you want to simplify. You want to essentially try, and again, it doesn't mean that you just create functions for the purpose of creating functions, okay? It's not like you're doing this because it's a good practice to make functions 2 to 3 lines long. It's a good practice to name things correctly and to create abstractions as much as you possibly can in the code to simplify things so that, and again, I told you about that blog post on why I think comments are bad. And what I really mean by that is that the code should be descriptive, because when you make the code as descriptive as possible, that's when you're going to get the less complexity. That's where you're going to have better understanding. And it's also more composable, right? The smaller functions that you have, the more you could swap them out, the more pieces, the smaller those Lego blocks are. Now, you could get crazy and make the Lego blocks too damn small, okay? That can happen. But for the most part, if you find those right-sized Lego blocks where the naming of them is sufficient to understand what's going on, and it adds to the understanding and reduces the complexity, then you can swap out some of those blocks and you have more points of flexibility in the system, more points where you could see patterns and create algorithms that would genericize, right, these n+1 type of scenarios, right, where you could figure out ways to generalize the code. And the more that you can generalize the code, then you can actually reduce that code. So, you know, again, if we talked about having 30-line functions, you might have some code duplication in there, some logic duplication, whereas if you said, oh, you know, I extract this out into like 5 different methods, and these methods handle these smaller pieces, and then some other point in the code, you realize you're doing the same thing, then you could make a generic handling for that, and you could actually reduce the code from both places. Whereas if you have it written in both places, you know, as 30 lines, and it's slightly different the way that it's written, you might not see that it's the same thing. Does that make sense to you? I think that's probably the clearest way that I could explain that. I could go on this subject for a long time because there's a lot of reasons for this. But if you see clean code, and that reminds me, I should point you to the book on this, which is called Clean Code by Robert Martin, Uncle Bob. One of the books I recommend more than any other book because it's really good. And if you read through that book, you'll get what I'm saying, because that he has just such great examples of how to refactor code and make it clean, and why it makes sense to have a lot more methods and to have these layers of abstraction, and why it actually simplifies things and doesn't complicate them. So anyway, I think David, right? I hate to disappoint you, or Dennis, and you know. But that's how it is. I got to tell you how it is. If you want to hear me tell you how it is, click the subscribe button below, and I will do that 2 to 3 times a day in my videos here on this channel. I will talk to you next time. Take care.